This video contains elements that are not suitable for children under the age of 14. Viewer discretion is advised.
With the 75th anniversary of Thomas and Friends having gone by, as well as reports of the show being revamped yet again, I've decided to give a retrospective on all 24 seasons of the show thus far, from its humble beginnings in 1984 all the way to 2020, between December of this year and February of next year. In case you're wondering, I won't be talking about the specials or the Jack in the Pack spin-off, because for now, I'm going to talk about the main show itself and see how well each season holds up. Before we begin, I should state that some opinions regarding certain episodes are bound to be controversial, but please keep in mind that each review is entirely opinion-based. If you want to give your own thoughts as to why you agree or disagree in the comments, that's fine. I know I've already done seasons 21 and 22 for the Emotions Corner, but I'm re-reviewing them solely for my own personal views, and also to see whether or not my views back then hold up now, especially since they aired a few years ago. Also, rather than out reviewing them episode by episode, because I make these reviews way longer than I want, I'll instead be talking about the nuts and bolts as to see what makes these seasons good or bad, as well as the history surrounding the franchise during that time. If you want to know what I think about each episode individually, I'll leave a link to a Google document for that in the description below. But if there's an episode you feel that I didn't fully elaborate on, don't hesitate to tell me, and I'll try to clarify as best as I can. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Zack Wanzer, and this is SODORAMA. Our story begins back in 1979 when Britt Allcroft met with Reverend Wilbert Awdry on the Bluebell Railway. Awdry was being interviewed for a feature on steam engines, and Allcroft had read some of his books prior to the interview, becoming fascinated with the likes of Thomas, James, and Percy, and wanted to make a television series off of the books, despite Awdry's initial skepticism. Though who could blame him, especially since previous attempts to get the books made into a show had failed. The first attempt at a televised adaptation was done by the BBC on June 14, 1953. Based upon the sad story of Henry. Directed by Douglas Mair and narrated by Julia Lang, the pilot was a dismal failure, especially when the model used to represent Henry derailed at a set of points, and a crew member's hand put it back on the rails. The negative media was so great that the series was quickly cancelled, and the footage, sadly, no longer exists. The second attempt was planned to be a musical television series directed by Brian Cosgrove and written by Andrew Lloyd Webber, known for his works such as Jesus Christ Superstar and Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Lloyd Webber approached Kagan Ward in 1973 with the proposal, and by 1976, the pilot episode was produced, believed to be in the style of another show about a sentient locomotive, Ivor the Engine. But sadly, by the following year, it had been cancelled due to a lack of interest, and with the success of the musical Evita, Lloyd Webber stayed in the music theater business, later producing hits such as Cats, The Phantom of the Opera, and Starlight Express. Lloyd Webber had formed a really useful group inspired from the phrase really useful engine, and his 1984 hit musical, the aforementioned Starlight Express, was inspired by the Railway series as a whole, showing that even though his television show didn't get off the ground, he still loved the books. And yes, I know there was another attempt in the 1970s on the children's show Jackanary, with the books read by Ted Ray, but I don't count that because they're straightforward retellings rather than taking a few liberties here and there. I only bring it up because you'll likely comment about it if I didn't. Anyway, the third and most successful attempt thus far was from Britt Allcroft in 1984, following a pilot in 1983 based upon Down the Mine, which was later refilmed to become the penultimate episode of the first season. While its date is unknown, it can be said that it was well received enough to justify a full-fledged series. A production crew was soon rounded up, including director David Mitton, music composers Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell, and narrator Ringo Starr, best known for being the drummer for the Beatles. It's funny to think now that at the start of the decade, his music career was floundering, and it wouldn't be till the end of the decade that interest in seeing him play music would be revived. Yeah, let's face it, the first half of the 80s were pretty rough for the former Beatles. John Lennon was murdered just as his career was restarting. Paul McCartney seemed to be spinning his wheels after he put out Tug of War. George Harrison's career went nowhere in England despite a semi-Beatles reunion reaching the top 10 in America. And Ringo's music career was put on an indefinite hiatus when Old Wave barely made it out of Germany and Canada. Good luck finding a copy of that or Stop and Smell the Roses. But I digress.
Thomas is a tank engine who lives at a big station on the island of Sodor. He's a cheeky little engine with 6 small wheels, a short stumpy funnel, a short stumpy boiler, and a short stumpy dome.
The first season of the show premiered on October 9th, 1984, and all stories, with the exception of Thomas's Christmas Party, were adapted from the first 8 books in the Railway series. The first 4 books were adapted in their entirety, with Edward's Day Out and Edward and Gordon from the first book merged together for Edward and Gordon, and James and the Top Hat and James the Bootlace from the third book merged to become James and Coaches. The only stories not adapted for season 1 were Henry and the Elephant, Percy and the Trousers, Mrs. Kindly's Christmas, Leaves, and Paint Pots and Queens. With the exception of Mrs. Kindly's Christmas, all were eventually later adapted for seasons 3 and 4, which we'll cover later. Meanwhile, Gordon's Whistle and Henry's Sneeze, both from Henry's book, are merged together to form Whistles and Sneezes, which means that 28 out of the original stories were adapted into 25 episodes. Round it out with Thomas's Christmas Party, and you got yourself a 26-episode season, which would set the standard for future seasons to come. So, how did the episodes of the first series stack up? Well, I think it's safe to say that for the most part, they are incredibly faithful adaptations of the original stories, but compared to later seasons, the episodes of season 1 will come off as a bit low-key and, well, bland. Right out of the gate, I'm going to throw some unpopular opinions out there, but visually, season 1 hasn't aged very well. They're not awful or anything, but if you compare the visuals of the first 7 episodes to what The Adventure Begins has to offer, season 1 does feel a bit simple. Story-wise, Edward and Gordon is kind of boring if you compare it to season 18's Old Reliable Edward. The latter just has a certain something that the former just can't compete with. Now, granted, we do get entertaining moments throughout the first series.
Inspector, he whispered, can you see fish?
And we get amazing episodes like Thomas and the Breakdown Train, Dirty Objects, and Thomas and Birdie, but they tend to be the exception as opposed to the rule. While I'm on the subject of unpopular opinions, out of the first series episodes, the sad story of Henry and the Flying Kipper have probably aged the worst. Let me put it this way, if you want to know what Audrey thought about Henry, I think these 2 episodes are solid proof of that. In the former, he wanted to keep Henry bricked up in the tunnel forever, but the publishers insisted on a story bringing him, Edward, and Gordon together to create a happy ending. While they had the right idea in retrospect, unfortunately, Henry became this albatross that would frustrate Audrey to no end during the first 6 books. No thanks to C. Reginald Dalby, someone who didn't really care about trains, and he practically became the problem child of the main cast, if later episodes that we'll get to soon enough are anything to go by. In the books, Henry was repainted blue, resulting in young children mistaking him for Gordon, most infamously in an illustration of Thomas and the Guard. For TV, Henry stayed green, presumably because of budget, but mostly so he was easier to identify, and so Audrey repainted him back to green for Troublesome Engines, but then he got questions as to why Gordon was repainted, so Audrey decided to alter Henry's shape for good in the Flying Kipper. Earlier, he wanted to quietly kill off Henry because of steaming problems, but fan power proved persistence, and Henry was here to stay. But I'm gonna say it, the Flying Kipper is greatly overhyped by the fandom. Visually, I can understand why people would love it. The atmosphere is great, the visual shots are stunning, and the music probably helped too, but the story is everyone what talks about last. Or is it the lack thereof? Much like Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, one of the greatest games for the Nintendo 64, people forget that the gameplay is why you bought it, and the story is more or less the reason people will watch a Thomas and Friends episode. The Flying Kipper is just the journey of a steam engine that happens to be sentient pulling a train before it crashes. That's it. I want to talk about the narration next. If you were to talk to anyone who grew up watching Thomas and Tank Engine, Ringo Starr's role as the narrator will inevitably follow. He wasn't even aware of the books while growing up, but a baby with Audrey changed his tune and he signed on to the role. According to an interview with TVAM, just as the show was kicking off, it took 8 days, basically a week, to record the entirety of the first series, and that included retakes for 4 episodes due to the tone in his voice. Looking back on his narration, Ringo sounds a lot more like he's reading a bedtime story, and that went better with some Ladybird audiobooks that he did, and his voices with the characters barely sound distinct from each other.
Well done, Percy. You started so quickly that you stopped a nasty accident. I'm sorry I was cheeky, said Percy. You were clever to stop. James, he asked, why are you red? I am a splendid engine, answered James. Ready for anything. You never see my paint dirty. Oh, said Toby innocently, that's why you once needed bootlaces, to be ready, I suppose. Hello, Henry, said Edward. You look splendid. I was pleased to hear your happy whistle yesterday. Thank you, Edward, smiled Henry. Shh, shh, can you hear something? It sounds like Gordon, said Edward, and it ought to be Gordon.
That being said, there's still a bit of fatherly charm to be found in his narration, and organically, he sounds better in the United Kingdom than he does in the United States. I mean, if you listen carefully, you can hear when a line was recorded in 1984 and in 1989 to suit American audiences with Shine Station. This also applies to Series 2, which we'll cover next time. Here's a couple of examples for Thomas and Gordon, or Thomas Gets Tricked.
He loves playing tricks on them, including Gordon, the biggest and proudest engine of all. Thomas likes whistling rudely at him. Wake up, lazy bones, why don't you work hard like me? He loves playing tricks on them, including Gordon, the biggest and proudest engine of all. Thomas likes to tease Gordon with his whistle. Wake up, lazy bones, why don't you work hard like me? Hurry up, you, said Gordon. Hurry yourself, replied Thomas. Gordon began making his plan. Yes, said Gordon, I will. And almost before the coaches had stopped moving, Gordon reversed quickly and was coupled to the train. Hurry up, you, said Gordon. Hurry yourself, replied Thomas. Gordon, the proud engine, began making his plan to teach Thomas a lesson for teasing him. Almost before the coaches had stopped moving, Gordon reversed quickly and was coupled to the train.
Even the ending dialogue is altered.
And had a long, long drink. He went home very slowly and was careful afterwards never to be cheeky to Gordon again. And had a long, long drink. Maybe I don't have to tease Gordon to feel important, Thomas thought to himself, and he puffed slowly home.
I can understand lines being changed as an American viewer, like myself, who would be more familiar, for example, with the term freight car as opposed to truck, and to avoid people with the term fat controller. But why were lines like the aforementioned examples altered? It wasn't like troublesome trucks or fat controller were ever mentioned, though probably the most jarring example would have to be the aforementioned sad story of Henry, or Come Out Henry, where the dialogue was changed up to make the story's context easier to understand so they could predict what would happen next.
Eventually, even the fat controller gave up. We shall take away your rails, he said, and leave you here for always and always and always. They took up the old rails and built a wall in front of him so that Henry couldn't get out of the tunnel anymore. Eventually, even Sir Topham Hatt gave up. We shall take away your rails, he said, and leave you here until you're ready to come out of the tunnel. They took up the old rails and built a wall in front of Henry, so that other engines wouldn't bump into him. Sudden dirt from the tunnel had spoilt his lovely green paint and red stripes anyway. He wondered if he would ever be allowed to pull trains again. But I think he deserved his punishment. Don't you? Sudden dirt from the tunnel had spoilt his lovely green paint and red stripes anyway. How long do you think Henry will stay in the tunnel before he overcomes his fear of the rain and then decides to journey out again?
I think it would have made much better sense if Ringo had re-recorded the episodes from the ground up, just so the difference wouldn't be so jarring. Listening to George Carlin's narrations, however, they flow a lot more naturally in the American dub than Ringo's partial re-narrations. The sole exception to this was whistles and sneezes, which remained unknown in America until George would take over as Mr. Conductor.
It isn't wrong, chuckled Henry, but we just don't do it.
Series 1 was the only series of the entire show's history to be filmed at Clapham Junction and Clearwater Studios in Battersea. For the second series all the way up to the 12th, the show would be filmed at Shepperton Studios. It's a bit like living in the town you were born in the first couple of years of your life before living the rest of your childhood all the way up to your adulthood in another. That's not hyperbole there, I should know. Some scenes for certain episodes were filmed alongside others. As an example, the first scene from Troublesome Trucks and one of the scenes from Tenders and Turntables, both of which took place at Tidmouth Sheds, were filmed alongside each other. While we don't know the order of the production for the episodes, it can be assumed that the final set made for filming was Toby's Old Tramway, which would explain why the majority of the Series 1 promotional images take place there. Presumably, Toby and the Stout Gentleman was one of the last episodes to be produced, along with B-roll footage of Thomas with Annie and Clarabelle that was later reused for a couple of Series 3 episodes, as well as several music videos. Not to mention B-roll footage featuring Percy pulling two vans in the brake van that was featured in the Island song. The models for the engines each required a Bartlett chassis, as those made for the original pilot models of Thomas and Gordon were unreliable. The model of the Fulber appears for one shot in Down the Mine, likely reused footage from the pre-production pilot. The bodies were made from perspex, and fittings such as buffers and brake pipes were provided by Tenbill, who also provided the models for most of the rolling stock. Markland even provided one of their own engines for background use, as well as some of the track alongside Tenbill. The engines were based upon the original C. Reginald Dalby illustrations, as were the majority of facial expressions, first being sculpted in clay, and then a silicone mold would be made and then cast and smoothed for molding and casting again, and then the final face would be painted. In some cases, faces were duplicated in case the crew needed a face to be both dirty and clean on the same day of shooting. Uniquely, Henry's model was built with the ability to be changed either into his old shape or his new shape since, as mentioned earlier, Series 1 was filmed out of sequence, and while the splashes were removed for his new shape to resemble Black 5 as best as they could, weirdly, they returned in Series 2, making him resemble some kind of Jubilee Patriot hybrid. Why couldn't they keep the splashes off for future seasons? All in all, as far as the first series goes for Thomas' tank engine, it's pretty solid overall. For just about nearly every show in existence, the first series is not always going to be great and will have imperfections that are likely to get ironed out over time. Thomas is of no exception to this. The visuals with the models will come off as dated compared to the CGI aesthetic of the current seasons, and the episodes are more or less verbatim retellings of the original books, but they still set the tone for the show overall, and it would eventually go on to last for over 30 years. It may not be the greatest thing put out to mankind, but I say it's worth checking out if you're just getting started with the franchise.
We all live by rules and regulations now.